When we look at the biggest offseason question for South Carolina's women's basketball program, which is who's going to replace Kamilla Cardoso, Dawn Staley has multiple options at her disposal.
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also the lead publisher for Gamecock Digest over on Fan Nation. Thank y'all so much for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team here today. We are free and available, as always, both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Got a lot to cover on this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. It's nice to be back in the home studio here in South Carolina. At the end of the show, we're going to talk about a new commit for Shane Beamer and South Carolina's football program in Brian Rowe. What could he offer the receiving core in terms of both his athletic skill set and also position-specific skills? We'll dive into all that later on. But we're going to talk about the biggest question today, primarily for South Carolina's women's basketball team, which is who is going to fill in Kamilla Cardoso's shoes? And it might not be a fair question because you might be able to sit there and say that there's no one that can adequately fill the shoes of Cardoso. But with what South Carolina has been able to do in the front court over the past several seasons, maybe we'll all be a little bit surprised that they will find somebody that can just seamlessly slide on into that role. And I do think that Dawn Staley has plenty of options. The answer may lie already on their roster. So let's talk about a couple of potential choices that the Gamecocks already have in-house, starting with rising senior Sania Feagin. Now, Sania offers a lot of benefits if she is the one that ends up taking over the starting center position for South Carolina. One, Sania is experienced. She has played in 96 games to this point in her career, which includes NCAA tournament games, Final Four games, national championship games. She is someone that understands very well what it takes to get through the grind of a season, and you cannot undersell that. In terms of her on-court skill set, Sania Feagin, offensively speaking, she offers you a ton. She's got really good footwork in the post, and she also possesses a solid mid-range jump shot. So she can not only take her defender on the low block and beat her that way, she could also face up to the basket. She's a little bit of a modern post player in the sense that she's not just going to play with her back to the basket all the time. She can indeed take 15 to 18-foot jump shots and can them. So Sania can attack defenders in a variety of different ways offensively. And she also has the potential to be a high-volume rebounder. Now, if you look at her stat line from the 2023-24 season, Sania Feagin's average rebounding total, I believe, works out to be about 3.6 or 3.8, which doesn't sound like a lot. But we have to keep this in mind. Sania Feagin primarily came off the bench unless there were some games where Kamilla Cardoso was not available, in which case she probably got a lot more playing time or even started then. So if we take that rebounding average and we take it to a 40-minute per game average, Sania Feagin would have averaged 10 rebounds per 40 minutes in the 2023-24 season. So essentially for every full game would have been about a double-double player in the post. So any question marks about Feagin's ability to contest on the glass, like a Kamilla Cardoso or an Aaliyah Boston or an Asia Wilson, that should be put to bed with what she was able to do in the time that she got this past season. Now, there is admittedly one potential concern with Sania Feagin potentially being the next center for South Carolina in their starting lineup, and that is the fact that there's going to be times where Sania Feagin is not going to have the height advantage. South Carolina, for the past several years, have been used to having a starting center that was 6'4", or in Cardoso's case, 6'7". Obviously, that's more of a luxury than the norm. Not every single team is going to have a center that is 6'5" or taller. I would say that 6'4" is about the tallest that you really would like to have at that spot, and anything on top of that is basically, it's gravy in essence. Sania Feagin is listed at 6'3" according to the roster's numbers. So there will be times where she is going to give up a little bit in terms of overall length. Again, you don't have to be 6'4" or taller to be a great rebounder, but it certainly does help. So that is one potential concern, along with the fact that Feagin, for all the experience she does have, she only has, I believe, 3 or 4 career starts to her name. And obviously, it's different when you are coming off the bench versus actually going out there as a part of the starting lineup. So, those are concerns to have with Sania Feagin. Then there's another player on this team that I do believe could fill in this role. And admittedly, this is a little bit more of a high-risk, high-reward proposition. That player is redshirt freshman Adhel Tac. Now, here are some of the pros that she would offer. 1, length would not be an issue. Adhel Tac would continue the long line of post players at South Carolina whom just through their height, they were problems, right? Adhel Tac is 6'5", according to the roster's numbers. So she would definitely not be much of a drop-off in that department from Kamilla Cardoso going to her. Also, it seems like Adhel Tac possesses a lot of potential. At one point, she was rated the number 12 recruit in the 2024 class. She finished, I believe, ranked 33rd due to reasons that I'll get into in just a minute. Also, Adhel Tac, even though her basketball playing experience has been limited, some people have brought up that she's only played a couple of years of organized basketball at the high school level. Adhel Tac went up against some really good competition. She played 6A high school girls basketball in the state of Texas. And obviously when it comes to high school sports, we all know what the state of Texas is like in that regard. If you can hold your own at that level, then very likely you're going to be a really good college player in your respective sport. Also, watching some of her YouTube highlights, Adhel Tac, some things that I do like about her game offensively, she has a very high release point. She's not someone that's just going to basically throw the ball up as her feet are leaving the floor. She's going to make sure that she lets it go at the highest point possible in her vertical jump. So she is very savvy in that regard. And also, I think that for someone that has not played basketball very long in her life, she has pretty decent touch on her shot as well. Not going to say she can shoot 15 to 18 foot jumpers like a Sania Feagin can, but the potential is there in that regard. Now, in terms of potential concerns, obviously it's experience. It's basically the inverse of Sania Feagin. Sania Feagin, one of the benefits she brings is experience. One of the biggest concerns with Adhel Tac is the lack of experience. She's never played a minute of Division I women's college basketball. You have to take that into account in that regard. And also, she is coming off of 2 injury-plagued seasons, the last of which prevented her from playing at all this season. So, Adhel Tac, the first thing that you might be worried about whenever she is fully cleared for basketball activities is just really and truthfully catching up to everybody else, whether it is maybe a little bit of strength conditioning, maybe it is just pure basketball skills. So she's definitely going to have to work hard in that regard. I'm sure that she is. Dawn Staley has made it clear that they have kept her involved when it comes to scouting reports so that at least mentally she is still kind of on the same page as everybody else. And she says that when it comes to her basketball IQ, her communication skills, and her defensive ability, she compared it to an Aaliyah Boston just a couple weeks ago. So it's very clear Dawn Staley thinks very highly of Adhel Tac. And if she is another Aaliyah Boston, even just on one side of the floor, she could wind up being a freshman starter or a redshirt freshman starter. But again, there are obvious worries there when it comes to her coming off of an injury, an operation on that lower body injury. And, again, you don't want to necessarily mess up sort of the chemistry in the locker room. If you were to choose her over Sania Feagin, you risk Sania Feagin maybe checking out mentally or even wanting to go into the transfer portal. And that's something that Dawn Staley's going to have to try to balance when it comes to trying to answer this question. Now, There also could be an answer in the transfer portal. And obviously, if you're South Carolina, it's a luxury for you because you get to be selective. You don't have to go out there and just get the biggest names. But there is one prominent name from the SEC itself that could wind up being the answer to the question of who could replace Kamilla Cardoso. I'll talk about that transfer portal player in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel. It's playoff time in the NBA and NHL, and baseball's in full swing. And FanDuel is your place to bet on every game. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. That's $150 win or lose. The Los Angeles Lakers are winding things down in the regular season in the NBA. They're currently in 9th place in the Western Conference and 1.5 games back of the 7th place Phoenix Suns. So the Lakers are likely going to be playing in the play-in tournament to try and actually be one of the 8 teams remaining in the Western Conference playoff side of the bracket. Now, the chances for the Lakers making it in the playoffs, they're not very high according to the FanDuel odds makers. Yes is listed at plus 198. No is listed at minus 250. Do you think the Lakers are going to miss out on the 8-team playoff portion of the bracket altogether? Or do you think they're going to make it? It's an interesting prop bet that you might want to put some money on if you're an NBA basketball fan. What are you waiting for? Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first bet an automatic win with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to this Wednesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily listen, wherever you get your audio podcasts daily, or your daily watch on YouTube. Now, in terms of the transfer portal, could Dawn Staley the Gamecocks go that route to try and answer the question of who's going to replace Kamilla Cardoso at the 5 spot for the Gamecocks this next season? There is one player in the portal that could very well provide an immediate solution, and that would be Kentucky transfer Asia Petty. Now, when it comes to Petty and what she offers, she has starting experience. Not an abundance of it, but enough to where she's worth at least taking a look at. She started all 32 games for the Wildcats this past season, and she knows this conference quite well, the SEC. Her first 2 years of college were at LSU, and then she played the last 2 years up in Lexington. And Petty proved last year she can hold her own in the paint area. She averaged 14.2 points and 10.6 rebounds per game. So averaged a double-double in 32 contests this past season. And one of those double-doubles, by the way, I believe was against South Carolina the second time around when the Gamecocks traveled up to Kentucky. I believe that Asia Petty had 16 and 10 in that contest and shot 50% or better from the floor. So Petty has proven herself against high-level competition as an SEC starter. But obviously, again, there are some potential risks here that you would be taking if you decided to bring in an Asia Petty. The first and most obvious one, as I kind of just alluded to a while back with Adhel Tac being named a starter over maybe Sania Feagin, would be you might mess up the dynamic in the locker room if you bring in an Asia Petty. And obviously for Dawn Staley, she's worked tremendously hard over the past 5-6 years to build up a culture and a locker room environment that is healthy, that is positive, where essentially you don't have a player or two that is basically just ruining everything for everybody else. Dawn Staley's already been through that song and dance before. I would imagine she would not want to go through that again just by embracing diving on into the portal. I'm not trying to say anything disparaging about Asia Petty. I'm not trying to infer that that would happen automatically, but it is a risk that you would absolutely be taking if you were to bring her in. The other thing is this. We talked about Sania Feagin already. If you bring in an Asia Petty, that basically would be signaling to Sania Feagin that you don't have full confidence that she can handle being the starter at the 5 spot. You risk, again, destroying Feagin's confidence, or maybe even causing her to jump into the portal herself if she still has time remaining afterwards. And the other thing with Asia Petty is this. Although she did quite well last season, if you're looking to maybe add a little bit of extra height or length to the starting 5 spot, Asia Petty's not going to really provide that for you. She's listed at 6'3" according to Kentucky's roster. So it's not like you're getting someone that's another Cardoso, 6'6", 6'7". And again, don't grow on trees, obviously. You're not going to find many players of that height and length that are that good. But it is something to keep in mind if Dawn Staley decides to look at the transfer portal. So, I'm just saying, if Dawn feels like she needs to go outside of the roster to get someone else to fill in Kamilla Cardoso's shoes, Asia Petty is probably the most likely and most obvious answer if she decides to go down that path. I know many Gamecock fans are going to say she should even consider it. And in a way, I agree with you. I do think that the answer already lies on the roster. I'm just saying, though, if Dawn Staley decides to go in the portal for this position, Asia Petty is far and away the best option in that regard. There could be other players out there too, but it's very hard to keep up with the transfer portal in women's college basketball. There's not like a dedicated site that does nothing but just look at transfer entries. There are some out there, but you got to create an account. It's very confusing, in all honesty. Hopefully somebody sort of, really pulls away from everybody else over the next year or two, and it's a bit easier to figure all that out. But just saying, if you bring up some other players in the comment section on YouTube, I'm absolutely willing to listen to it. It's just that Asia Petty was the most obvious answer out of all the sites that I was able to view that actually were up to date with recent portal entries. So, Dawn Staley, plenty of options there in terms of who she wants to pick to replace Kamilla Cardoso, but still a dilemma that the Gamecocks are going to have to figure out this off-season on the hardwood. Now, Shane Beamer and South Carolina's football program, they're starting to get a little bit of momentum going once again on the recruiting trail. They landed 2 commits on Tuesday afternoon, and one of them wound up going public in wide receiver Brian Rowe. So, what could Brian offer the Gamecocks football program should he stay committed and get to campus? We'll talk about some of the skills that he could offer in a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is now an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets even faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. And you can save up to 60% off buying last minute for games at the ballpark. The Atlanta Braves are currently playing the New York Mets right now in Truist Park in Atlanta, and they're going to be playing another game on Thursday, and that game right now has got some pretty low ticket prices. You can get tickets as cheap as $3 in the grandstands if you want to go and check out that divisional rival matchup. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. All you got to do is download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCOLLEGE for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Welcome back to today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day in just 30 minutes. All right, to end today's show, let's talk about South Carolina's newest football commit in 4-star wide receiver Brian Rowe out of the state of North Carolina. So a rare win for the Gamecocks when it comes to their northern neighbor. South Carolina has struggled to get players out of that state over the past several years, so maybe Brian Rowe's commitment, is a sign that times are changing a little bit in that regard. But Brian Rowe, obviously a get at the wide receiver position, which is a position that South Carolina needs to attack heavily this recruiting cycle, because You've got a lot of experienced and veteran players already there. A Gage Larverdane, I believe, being a fourth-year player. Amari Bruce Huggins, a fourth-year player, I believe. There's a lot of experience, and therefore a lot of upperclassmen. They're going to be walking out the door likely after this season, no matter what happens. So you've got to get some young, fresh blood in this wide receiver room. And Brian Rowe definitely helps you out in that regard. Now, when talking about Brian Rowe's skill set, let's start with some of the athletic traits that he possesses. The first thing that jumps out to me when I watch Brian Rowe's highlights from his huddle film is he has near elite acceleration. When you think about star athletes, you think about guys that probably are getting up to their top speed the first 10, 15, 20 yards of their route, and by that point, they're pretty much at their max speed, and that's where they stay for the majority of the rest of the play. That's not the case with Brian Rowe. Brian Rowe can be like 20, 25, 30 yards down the field, and he's still gaining speed. And it's not because this guy is slow, okay? Brian Rowe's got very quick feet, but he's a very quick twitch athlete, and he's got an extra gear that he possesses that not many other receivers have. So that is probably the trait that stands out the most with him when it comes to his athleticism. Another thing that I noticed is his hand-eye coordination. This is not a guy that struggles catching the football. This is a guy that is really good at contorting his body, getting his hands in the right spot, and making it to where basically he either just has to assume he's going to get the ball by looking ahead down the field, or a defender's got to make a great play to dislodge the ball so that he doesn't come down with the catch. Very, very smooth with how he catches the football. The way that he catches the ball, it kind of makes me think that he's a multi-sport athlete. I don't know that off the top of my head, but I think that he had to have played baseball or basketball, or maybe still plays one of those two sports, because he's just, it's like, it's very easy for him to catch the football, is what I'm trying to say. So, hand-eye coordination, he's got that checked off. And then acceleration, he's got that as well. Two traits that you love to have in a wide receiver prospect. Now, when we talk about position-specific skills, he can high point the ball at a very high level. Goes back to his hand-eye coordination. And he can also catch and hold on to the football in a contested window. So even if you have a defender that's at least got his hand kind of in front of his point of view, where his eyes are looking, Brian Rowe is not fazed by that very easily. Again, he's still able to reel in the football. You have to work extra hard as a defensive back to prevent him from catching the ball if he's got his hands in the right spot. So again, that's something that you want in a wide receiver. And here's the other thing. When it comes to his routes that he runs, Brian Rowe is already running double moves. Double moves, basically, it's kind of a combination of two separate routes that are meshed into one. He already is running some of that at the high school level. You don't see that quite often at that level. It's definitely advanced for the stage he is at in his football career. And also, whether it is because they train this or it's because sometimes the quarterback does make a bit of an inaccurate throw and he's got to adjust, he already has gotten pretty versed in terms of making back shoulder catches. So, in terms of having to adjust to his surroundings, to the throw itself, Brian Rowe already has shown that he can do that to a very high degree. I think this is a very good pickup for South Carolina. I see a lot of potential here with Brian Rowe. I see this guy being sort of a yak receiver on short yardage routes and a big play receiver on shot plays going deep down the field. Brian Rowe, I think, is going to be able to do both of those things. If there's one potential concern or maybe one area where you would like to see him get a little bit better, just from my casual eye watching his film, I think that he's a little bit small in terms of his weight. I think he probably wants to pack on a couple of lbs to his frame, but he's got his whole senior year of high school ball to do that, and also he'll have the offseason going into his freshman year at South Carolina, assuming he sticks, of course, to do just that. So, good pickup for Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks. Mike Fury getting his first commit as South Carolina's wide receivers coach. Be interesting to see if they can add some more bodies to that group throughout the rest of this recruiting cycle. With that being said, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. Hope that y'all thoroughly enjoyed today's show as always. What are y'all's thoughts on the question regarding Kamilla Cardoso's replacement for South Carolina's women's basketball team? Do you think the answer is already on the roster? Or do you think Dawn Staley needs to go out to the portal and look for somebody to fill in that void? And what are your thoughts on new wide receiver commit Brian Rowe and what he could offer the football team? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you watch today's show on YouTube, or you can shoot me a direct message on X at @ALion_SC if you listen to today's show on an audio podcast app. As always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Wednesday, and I'll be sure to catch y'all on the next show of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.